Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. Excess capacity is no longer waste, it's a strategic asset. For decades, the dominant management objective was efficiency: reduce waste, improve utilization, maximize returns per unit of capacity. That logic hasn't disappeared, but the environment in which it operates has changed enough that the calculus around excess capacity deserves a serious second look. Lean supply chains, just-in-time inventories, asset utilization targets, workforce optimization, energy efficiency programs. The management doctrine of the past 30 years was built on a single premise: unused capacity is waste, and waste is the enemy of performance. The organizations that executed that doctrine most rigorously often outperformed those that didn't. Then, the conditions that made that doctrine work began to change. Supply chains that were optimized for a stable, predictable world proved brittle when the world became unstable. Infrastructure that was sized precisely to current demand offered no buffer when demand shifted. Organizations built for efficiency discovered that efficiency and resilience are not the same thing, and that the difference between them becomes visible only when something goes wrong. What's different in 2026 is that the pattern is becoming consistent enough that many executives no longer view it as temporary disruption. It looks like the operating environment: why systems optimized for efficiency have limited tolerance for constraint. The efficiency doctrine works well when inputs are available, timelines are predictable, and the variables a plan depends on remain stable. It fails when any of those conditions breaks down, because there is no slack in the system to absorb the failure. The World Economic Forum's Global Value Chains Outlook 2026 found that resilience and agility have become significantly higher priorities for business leaders over the past 5 years. That shift isn't philosophical. It reflects what happened to organizations that entered the constraint environment of the past several years with fully optimized systems and no room to maneuver. According to Boston Consulting Group, BCG, companies pursuing resilience pathways face an inevitable tension. Each resilience investment could result in higher costs. The question is whether those higher costs are less than the cost of operating without resilience when disruption arrives. In a growing number of sectors, the answer has become clearly yes. The supply chain parallel is the most familiar version of this argument, but it applies with equal force to energy infrastructure, water access, permitting pathways, and labor capacity. Supply chain analysts tracking 2026 corporate behavior describe a broad shift from lean, cost-focused models to diversified, redundant networks, driven by the recognition that geopolitical shocks, policy changes, and infrastructure constraints are not isolated events, but recurring features of the current operating environment. Capacity is becoming harder to acquire after it is needed. The traditional argument for lean operations assumed that capacity could be added when it was needed. That assumption is breaking down in several categories simultaneously. Power capacity is the clearest example. Thunderset Energy's March 2026 analysis of NERC reserve margin data projects significant deterioration in grid reserve margins over the next decade as surging demand and resource retirements narrow the buffer across multiple regions. NERC has identified elevated resource adequacy concerns in several regions, including PJM and MISO, under certain demand and resource scenarios. A facility with existing electrical capacity today holds something that will be considerably harder and slower to acquire in 5 years. That changes its value, even if current utilization metrics don't reflect it. The same dynamic applies to supplier relationships, permitted sites, and workforce capability. ARC Group's April 2025 analysis of supply chain resilience identified the core problem. Without a tangible financial case, resilience projects are frequently sidelined in favor of more quantifiable growth or efficiency initiatives. The ROI on maintaining a qualified backup supplier, holding a permitted site in reserve, or retaining workforce capacity above current utilization is invisible until the primary supplier fails, the permit is needed on short notice, or the labor market tightens. By then, acquiring that capacity from scratch takes longer and costs more than maintaining it would have. Infrastructure access is now a strategic position, not a utility function. For most of the past 2 decades, infrastructure access was treated as a facility management function. Power came from the grid, water came from the utility, permits were obtained when projects required them. None of those inputs was considered a strategic variable. That framing is changing. Industrial sites with existing utility capacity and established permitting pathways are commanding premiums that reflect something utilities and facility managers understand, but that hasn't fully entered strategic planning conversations. Access to infrastructure that is scarce is worth more than access to infrastructure that is abundant. A site that appears underutilized on a traditional asset efficiency metric may in fact be holding capacity that cannot be replicated quickly in the current environment. The organizations recognizing this earliest are those in energy-intensive sectors where the constraint arrived first. Data center operators that secured power agreements and water access in 2022 and 2023 are today operating in markets where equivalent agreements are significantly harder to obtain and, in some markets, unavailable within commercially acceptable timelines. That early capacity is not waste. It is competitive position, balancing efficiency with resilience, not choosing between them. None of this is an argument for abandoning efficiency. An organization that abandons cost discipline in favor of indiscriminate capacity accumulation is not building resilience. It is building overhead. The goal is not to hold as much spare capacity as possible. It is to hold spare capacity in the specific categories where the cost of not having it when it is needed exceeds the cost of maintaining it. IMD's research on dual-purpose resilience levers identifies the practical approach: strategies and resources that enhance resilience while also improving efficiency during non-disrupted periods. Reserved electrical capacity that enables faster expansion. Dual-source supplier relationships that reduce negotiating risk during shortages. Pre-permitted sites that compress development timelines when investment decisions are made. Long-term transmission rights that provide cost certainty when spot markets tighten. Each appears inefficient when measured solely against utilization. Each becomes valuable when the constraint arrives. For years, excess capacity was often viewed as waste on a balance sheet. That framing made sense when conditions were stable and capacity could be added on demand. In the current operating environment, it is increasingly functioning as insurance against constraints that are proving more persistent than the efficiency doctrine anticipated. The real strategic asset is not unused capacity itself. It is the optionality that capacity creates. Organizations with excess electrical capacity can expand sooner. Organizations with multiple qualified suppliers can respond faster. Organizations with permitted sites can deploy capital more quickly when conditions allow. Capacity matters because it preserves options when conditions change. And in the second half of 2026, the organizations that have built that optionality will have choices that those that optimize too precisely will not. Sustainability Soundbites energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's spotlight on energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.